On behalf of the School of Business and the Business for a Better World Center, we really want to thank you for coming to our Fall Speakers Series this afternoon. We're really pleased to have two distinguished guests with us, Dymphna van der Lans and Jean-Louis Racine. After I introduce them, Dymphna and Jean-Louis will share some thoughts with us, and then I, Lisa Green-Pemble, along with my colleague Anne Magro, will help moderate the conversation. As a reminder, this event is being recorded with the permission of our speakers. And I'm going to take some time to introduce them because the records of our guest speakers are absolutely extraordinary. Dymphna van der Lans is the Chief Executive Officer of the Clean Cooking Alliance, and she brings more than 25 years of experience managing and leading global development, energy, and climate initiatives in the nonprofit and private sectors. She's led international corporate engagement with the World Wildlife Fund's Climate and Energy Team, has worked with the Clinton Foundation as CEO of the Clinton Climate Initiative, and has served as the Senior Director for Public Policy Programs at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Dymphna has also served as the Director of Global Renewables, Infrastructure, and Energy Efficiency at a specialist investment banking firm in London, and for 7 years at BP, where her last appointment was a BP Alternative Energy's Director of Distributed Energy Markets. Dymphna's worked and lived in China, India, and Kenya, and engaged with island nations in the Caribbean and the Indian and Pacific Oceans to support their transition away from polluting diesel fuels to renewable sources of energy. Her native language is Dutch, but in addition, she speaks English and Chinese fluently and has conversational ability in both French and German. She holds advanced degrees from Leiden University and the University of Beijing and has earned a master's in business administration from Rice University. Jean-Louis Racine is the Chief Program Officer at the Clean Cooking Alliance. He manages the market strengthening team, as well as the overall development, strategic planning, implementation, and management of the Alliance's work in Haiti. Prior to joining the Alliance, Jean-Louis worked at the World Bank, where he led InfoDev's climate technology program and was involved in the design and implementation of ecosystem-level initiatives to build new markets for climate change technologies. At the World Bank, Jean-Louis also worked with numerous governments to develop and deploy strategies, policies, and programs to promote innovation and entrepreneurship. Jean-Louis has focused much of his career around organizational innovation and launched a corporate accelerator for World Bank and International Finance Corporations teams to develop novel support instruments for green innovation. Before joining the World Bank, Jean-Louis worked in a private consulting practice and startup foundry where he advised regional governments and businesses on innovation-based competitiveness strategies. His practical experience with technological innovation involves working on product design and engineering in sectors spanning rural micro hydropower, hydraulic systems, medical devices, and robotics in various countries. Jean-Louis holds a PhD in mechanical engineering from the University of California at Berkeley and master's degrees in technology policy for economic development from Columbia University and in mechanical engineering from Stanford University. So you can see why we are very blessed to have these two incredibly talented individuals with us today. So we welcome the two of you. Thank you again for sharing your time and expertise with our community. The floor is yours, and I invite our participants to use the chat box to share questions and comments as our speakers share the incredible work they are doing with the Clean Cooking Alliance. Over to you.
Great, thank you, Lisa. Just quickly, like from my perspective, before we dive into a bit of a dialogue that we've created between Jean-Louis and myself. So just thank you for everybody for joining. I personally always get so much energy in interacting and engaging with students, as I know Jean-Louis does as well. So thank you so much for inviting us and for welcoming us into your community. It's really a delight to be here. I want to acknowledge the fact that we have some other people from the organization joining, and so want to make sure that Astrid Sorensen, who is also on the call right now, is also at the Clean Cooking Alliance. He works as the Chief of Staff for the organization, and I noticed that Jacinta is online as well. I don't know if you have the ability to turn on your video, Jacinta, or you may be out for a walk, but wanted to sort of acknowledge the fact that she is wonderful, one of our wonderful, talented members of the organization and really focuses on our gender strategy. So as far as I can I think that's it, unless I've missed somebody from our organization, but just wanted to acknowledge that it's not just Jean-Louis and myself who are representing the organization here. So joined by two others. And so with that, maybe Jean-Louis, do you want to kick it off?
I do. So thank you, Lisa, for welcoming us. And thanks to the George Mason community. Really, really happy to be here. Dymphna, I'd like to ask you a first question. What made you join the Alliance as CEO in April 2008, the Clean Cooking Alliance?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's remarkable for me to think that it's already 2.5 years ago that I've been with this organization. I mean, I think various reasons why I decided to join. I had been aware of the issue for many, many years, and started to really be aware around the issue of clean cooking and the lack of access to clean cooking and the impact that has on global communities, especially in the global South. Probably around 2005 or 6, when I worked at BP and did a lot of work in India and China and Asia at that moment, and started to really become aware of the issue. So about 15 years ago, had never really considered working in it because I've always thought of myself much more as an energy person. And I think because of some of the sort of old way of describing this issue, it was always more about stoves and sort of, it felt more like a product placement than necessarily an energy issue. And so I myself had never really engaged in it. But then as I went through my career and started to sort of grow as a leader and got more and more sort of executive experiences under my belt, and the more significant one was when I was the CEO of the Clinton Climate Initiative, really continued to have a big passion for energy, but also shifted my personal attention and where my personal energy goes to just leadership writ large. I realized in that position as the CEO of the Clinton Climate Initiative, just how much I enjoy leading an organization that is doing good work. I really enjoy that strategic direction and working with teams and trying to think through what is working for the organization, how to improve it, but really that's sort of the leadership executive aspects of certain positions are really interesting to me as well. And so when this opportunity came up, the combination of continuing to focus on energy, continuing to focus on issues that have deep impact for the households and the families that we're working for, combined with the fact that it was a leadership position, was just really interesting to me. And so once I started that process and started to explore it, I got even more excited, because one of the things I realized about myself is that although tremendous privilege to work obviously for President Bill Clinton for about 3 years and lead his portfolio of work, it was a very broad portfolio. So I had climate, energy, oceans, and forestry in my portfolio. And so if you think about sort of, I had energy transition, climate mitigation, and both of the carbon sinks in my portfolio, which is really a very big portfolio. And as much as I enjoyed that, what I've now realized after having been at the CEO of CCA for about 2.5 years is that my mind works much better when the issue is narrowly defined. And so this is the one thing I do every single day. I wake up and I pour all my energy in thinking through, how do we address this one particular issue? But the only way we can do it is if we, in that narrow focus, then go super broad again and use a whole systems approach and think about all the different things that need to be done in that whole ecosystem to address that issue. What I've realized is my mind and my personality and my energy are better aligned with a narrow focus and a broad approach towards a super broad focus and a super broad approach. So maybe my mind is just not able to hold too much information. Like, I actually really enjoy in this particular position that it's such a narrowly defined issue to which I can really deploy my whole mind, if you will. And so, yeah, it's been just a really amazing journey for me in the last 2.5 years. And I've learned a lot as a leader. And one of the things I've learned is that I need more talent, which is what led me to do a search for a chief program officer. And the reason why I say that, and we can talk a little bit more to sort of leadership towards the end of this conversation, if that's of interest to you as well. But like, I am fully aware of the things I don't do really well and what I do not bring to this organization. And so, Lisa, when you were doing the introductions, I'm hoping that the students picked up on the fact that Jean-Louis' background and skill sets and experience is significantly different from mine. And so I have just been so excited that Jean-Louis joined our organization, but he did it much more recently. And so sort of for you, Jean-Louis, which may be a little weird because I'm the one who hired you into this organization, but why are you here and why are you working on this?
Well, this is like a second interview.
Yeah.
I'm a little nervous now. So my background is basically in market development. So for the past 15 years, I've been looking at how do we promote market development through entrepreneurship and innovation. So either from a public policy lens or from a sort of international organization lens or a program lens, can you set up programs, activities, policies that or investments that ultimately lead to market development in niche markets that aren't yet realized, but that have a lot of potential and a lot of spillovers that are economic, that are social, that are environmental. And I saw clean cooking as basically the ultimate market development challenge. I can't think of another one. There's in sort of relative to the size of the problem, there's very little public funding or subsidies for clean cooking. And it certainly falls very, very, very short of the needs that are required basically to get clean cooking in the hands of the 3 billion people on Earth who don't have it and who are suffering from it right now. So the sector basically has the ultimate challenge where there are opportunities for the users of clean cooking, for the climate change in general, for jobs. There are a lot of different opportunities, but they're not being tackled by the market on its own. So the sector needs new business models, but business models that are sustainable and scalable. It also needs businesses that are viable investments, because basically public subsidies alone can't get clean cooking in the hands of 3 billion people. That's just not possible. There's just not enough sort of willingness of, governments out there to just funnel all this money and cash, and maybe with all the competing needs, there are needs everywhere. There's poverty everywhere. There's malaria, there's tuberculosis, there's COVID. So how do you bring in the private sector? That's the ultimate sort of question in a market that's not yet very big, that's very risky, not yet very sort of a sure deal for investors. So that's really the ultimate challenge, and we're not there yet. We're very far from there. So, for example, as of 2017, there were $40 million of investments in clean cooking, and we're looking at needing a figure of more like 4 billion to meet the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals related to clean cooking. So a huge gap there. So the question is, how do we, as an organization, help reach that gap? So that another reason why I was really attracted to this, the Clean Cooking Alliance, is that this challenge requires a lot of creativity. Obviously, it hasn't been done before. There's limited resources, but I really saw the Clean Cooking Alliance as a lean and nimble organization with lots of convening power. So really a kind of history of having done things that kind of, really kind of great in pushing the clean cooking agenda. But also the team, as you can see from Dymphna and I, we're very, very different in terms of our expertise. And you could actually say that across the board, if you looked at all of the staff in the Clean Cooking Alliance. So this diverse expertise, and management research, as you may know, really shows that diverse teams lead to more innovation and more unique and impactful ideas than if you have everybody, the same person, cloned across the team. And so that, to me, that's really a good recipe for finding and implementing solutions. We have, everybody, from gender experts, from behavioral change experts, from former investors in the team. We have people who are more focused on public policy. There are basically lots of different profiles. And I would say that a lot of these profiles are also T sort of, profiles where there's a deep expertise in one topic, but we still remain nimble because we have also this broad T with lots of other sort of general expertise. So to me, the team also really attracted me. I felt like this was a team where we could, tackle jointly a problem that's really hard and requires creativity and innovation.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Oh,
no, that's basically why I joined.
Great, and we're delighted to have you. So maybe if that's okay, I saw some of the questions coming up in the chat. Say a little bit more about what the organization does and how we're currently structured. That I think would be helpful as we continue this conversation with all of you. So we're not a big organization. We're like roughly around 25 people. We've been around for about 10 years. And are working towards meeting Sustainable Development Goal 7. So we have another, less than 10 years to actually achieve that goal, which means we ultimately strive to make sure that there is universal access to clean cooking, full stop. And so as an organization, we're an NGO. We are not a traditional implementer kind of NGO. We don't have people in other parts of the world per se. So because we are hosted at the UN Foundation, we are really currently still very much focused on having a base here in the United States, but then working through partnerships in other countries to implement some of our work. So we're not what maybe you've seen with other sort of more traditional implementing NGOs kind of organization either. We, as Jean-Louis was saying, we're really quite small and nimble. Our theory of change and why we do this work is really grounded in the idea that if you want to address a development issue, like making sure families across the world do not use dirty fuels to prepare their food, like fundamentally that's what we're doing. If you want to address that big issue at the scale that's required, you're gonna need some efforts that are grounded in sustainable business models, because to rely on development aid forever and ever and ever is not sustainable and not realistic. And so as an organization, we are really foundationally focusing on like, what does it mean and what is needed to make sure that we create an industry with our partners, obviously, but like, how do we create an ecosystem that supports growth and supports reaching these billions of people with products that they want to purchase, that they can afford to purchase, that they want to use, that they continue using. And our job really is in service of the businesses and others in the countries that are trying to meet that need. And so really whatever my team can do to support that is really how we're sort of anchoring ourselves. And so that can vary from providing technical assistance to companies directly, and Jean-Louis can talk a little bit more about that. It can mean that we work with companies, which Jacinta is doing, around women in leadership position and how can we strengthen their leadership skills going forward. It can mean that we work with policymakers in Kenya to make sure that their energy policies include a solid policy around making sure that their population has access to clean cooking. It can mean that I speak at the UN about the importance of this issue to make sure that sort of high-level political awareness continues to be raised, and I have the opportunity to continue to bring that to people's attention. And it can mean that we are really focused on sort of in the space that is progress, how do we measure that? How do we verify it? How do we make sure we hold ourselves and others accountable through our theory of change and a robust M&E framework underneath it? So I hope that answered a little bit of sort of like, it's great that two of you are chatting to each other here, but really, what do you do as an organization? And a little bit sort of address that question. of course, happy to sort of answer more questions about that in the next sort of in the Q&A. But fundamentally, what we're trying to do is, create a supportive ecosystem so that an industry can thrive. Because at some point, and this may come as a surprise to some of you, we have to exit as an organization. I should not be around in 10 years. If this organization still exists in its current setup in 10 years, I have failed as a leader because we should be out of a job by that time. I hope that sort of made it clear. I'll look to you, Lisa, and see if that sort of helped sort of clarify what the organization does.
Yes, it did for me, and but if it doesn't for others, keep those questions coming.
Yeah, it's super helpful. And so maybe, Jean-Louis, if I can sort of turn it back to you, do you want to say a little bit more about, like, on the venture, on our sort of clean cooking, the industry catalyst, like what does it actually mean when we say we're providing support to the companies to make sure that they're investable ready? Like, can you share a little bit more about day-to-day what that team actually does?
Yeah, so we have basically three components to what we call our cooking industry catalyst. We have something called the demand catalyst, we have the market catalyst, and we have the venture catalyst. And basically these three sort of prongs to our approach are meant to look at all sides of the market and are meant to look at the market as a system. The demand catalyst is really looking at the consumer and what is it that can make consumers want to actually spend money to purchase clean cooking solutions, so cook stoves or fuels or other sort of solutions that go around that. How do you get, specifically in many cases, how do you get people to spend more money than they would otherwise have spent for something that they may not at first perceive beneficial, and for something that has a lot of environmental spillovers and public good effects that they may not see, or justifiably they may not care about because it's spread all over to the whole world. So that's the demand catalyst, and I think that's a key one. That's a key problem to crack that I would say nobody has solved yet, but we're on our way. The other one is on the other side of the market equation, is on the supply side, is what we call the venture catalyst. And here, what we're looking for is companies that have potential to scale, either because themselves they will get bigger and get more market share, or because they have business models that are replicable. Could be through franchises, could be through imitation, but we feel that these companies have something in them that can really advance clean cooking globally. And what we're looking for is ways in which these companies aren't able to tackle the challenges of the markets because of internal capability issues, because there may be risk issues, there may be financing issues, and we're looking at ways to help those companies. So in some cases, it's very individualized and tailored to the company. In other cases, it's more general. The problem is a lot of these companies are small. They're early stage startups in some cases. They are dealing with technologies that are basically at the frontier with diverse technologies. So we see, in cooking, you could have, thermodynamics, you could have combustion, and you could have digital technology, you could have financing, there's a lot of fintech coming into this space with consumer financing. And it's really hard for a company to be an expert in all of these. On top of that, you're adding the fact that they're operating in very challenging environments. The countries we work in may not have the market infrastructure you need that you would have in Silicon Valley if you're a startup, basically. Starting with regulations, you may not even have roads that allow you to do your marketing. You may not have sources of finance. So you basically need to innovate around all of that. You have to innovate a lot more than you would in a sort of supportive environment. That if you were in Silicon Valley or even DC, the market basically takes care of a lot of stuff for you. In the countries we work in, the firms are expected to innovate in ways that really they wouldn't be expected to in other places. The other component is what we call the market catalyst. And here we're looking at how might we tackle market gaps. So these could be market failures, market system gaps that enable a typical market to thrive. And here, these market gaps could be related to the fact that we're operating in low or middle income countries that don't have markets that offer everything that you would in more sort of high income countries. But we're also dealing with an overall market, like sector, let's say, clean cooking, which is very thin, meaning that there are very few, relatively to other sectors that are more advanced, there's very few players and there are smaller players. And that usually means there's less information flow. There are fewer services. There's less knowledge of the sector. So an investor may sort of look at the sector and say, well, I don't understand this sector. The risk is too big. I don't know what I'm getting into. I'm not going to invest. Show me something like an app that I'll invest in because I've seen lots of apps or something that they can relate to. So it's here we're looking at how is it that we can include in the market catalyst, bring in tools, information, in some cases even sort of help new players establish themselves that are sort of bridging market gaps, or even working with policymakers to develop supportive policies to the sector. So those are basically the three aspects of what we're doing under what we call market strengthening. So it's the demand catalyst, the market catalyst, and the venture catalyst. So that, I mean, in sum, gives a part of what the Clean Cooking Alliance is working on. It's not obviously all that the Clean Cooking Alliance is working on, but that's basically what brings us to the sector. And maybe Dymphna, something that might be worth pointing out is, why are we doing all this? Why do we care so much about clean cooking? Why is this something that the Clean Cooking Alliance is tackling? Love to hear your articulation of that.
Yeah, because real simple, because it's unacceptable that this is still a topic we have to talk about. It's unacceptable to me that in a time and age where we have self-driving cars, and like I get a message on my phone when my dishwasher or my washing machine are finished, we still have half of the population who have to go out, collect wood, and use open fires to prepare their food. And when they're doing that, first of all, they're spending hours and hours and hours. Very often it's women and children collecting that wood, which exposes them to all sorts of potential harm, including just sexual violence. And then they're coming back and having to go over open fires, which through the indoor air pollution directly hurts themselves and their children and their families. And so the direct impact on the families, half of this population in this world, it's just unacceptable to me. Like I still cannot really wrap my head around the fact that we even have to have this conversation. And so, yeah, I always get a little, anyway. And so the sort of the direct impact on the families is really, really strong and striking. And but combined with that, there's impacts that people are maybe not super familiar with, which is indoor air pollution has a direct impact on outdoor air pollution. And so in our current conversation, and when we're thinking about sort of environmental and social challenges for society, that's a hard word for a Dutch native speaker, but challenges to our society, especially now in COVID-19 and sort of an increased awareness about indoor air pollution and how that impacts people's respiratory health and sort of susceptibility to certain diseases. Like that sort of starts to play into the impact part of our work as well. So there's health impacts, there's direct impacts on climate, there's impacts on just environment, because a lot of this is still done through unsustainable forestry and sort of deforestation as a result. And you can go even further, like if you think about certain markets where we're working in, like the deforestation leads to watershed management and sort of water sort of erosion and sort of impacts on agriculture and food systems. So all of that combined is when my mind goes like this, like there are so many impacts that we're trying to address and work for. And so, yeah, fundamentally, this is about human dignity and making sure that we work collectively with our partners to make sure that families across the world are healthy and resilient and have the ability to make decisions about how they're preparing their food, and through that not exposing themselves and their children to really dire impacts. There was a report released today, and I don't know if you've seen it, that adds additional data to why this is such an important issue, as in the millions of premature deaths each year that occur because of indoor air pollution. And so if you haven't seen it, I really encourage you to look it up, and we can share sort of links to it later. But it's really sobering, and it's really, yeah, unacceptable. So that is why we do this work. Jean-Louis, I don't know if you want to add something to that. Oh, sorry, I think you're still on mute. I don't know how many times you guys say this today, but I say it a lot.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's really about improving people's lives, and doing so in a way that's kind of going to solve a lot of problems at the same time, and doing so in a way that is also not disruptive to people's lives, but improves their lives. We don't want people to be giving up anything, to be paying more than they would have otherwise. People who have very limited means already, to make those improvements. So there's a whole sort of public goods aspect to it. If we think of, governments as, having a role or mandate over public health, or I mean, now more than ever, that's really apparent, but all over the environment, there's really that aspect of it that comes into play. It's definitely not an issue that can be owned completely by the private sector, because profit maximizing markets won't necessarily end solving societal challenges that also reinforce poverty cycles. So very, very much cross-cutting in terms of its nature.
Yeah, I just had a chance to look at some of the questions, Lisa, and I think it'd be great if towards the end, if you wouldn't mind moderating some of those, because they are absolutely spot on. So want to make sure we get to those questions as well.
Of course.
Yeah, and specifically really appreciated also the references to sort of our work in Bangladesh, and sort of just the localizing the impact, I think, is always important in these conversations. And so maybe, if I'm just checking our time, maybe if it's okay, Jean-Louis, we'll transition a little bit sort of more to a quick conversation between us about sort of our leadership journeys at the organization, and then hand it over to you, Lisa, in about 10 minutes or so we can move into more Q&A for the students, if that's okay. So Jean-Louis, I think one of the things that I always admire about, or not all, but like admire about you and working with you, is that how your mind is so differently wired from mine, and I am not joking, like I really learn so much from Jean-Louis every single day that I'm working with him, which is really humbling. But can you share a little bit with the students about sort of how you apply your mind to this issue, which is a little different from how I apply my mind to this issue, and sort of what have you seen that works with the teams, and when you're trying to introduce new processes and sort of getting people to think differently?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I joined virtually this job, and I guess a lot of other people in this world have joined new jobs completely virtually, or new university programs, and have never met their peers in person. There's only a handful of people I had actually met at the Clean Cooking Alliance before I joined 6 months ago. And so I think on top of the normal challenge of coming into a leadership position, in terms of being new to a topic and to a sort of team, I had this additional challenge of working virtually. And so I've looked at many different ways of tackling that. To me, the first thing was really to be a very active listener in a normal job, in a normal office environment, I mean, you get a lot from informal conversations, from body language, from, you know, unplanned encounters where you talk about things, and a lot more knowledge flows and trust builds over time when you're face to face. And so what I found in my sort of, you know, short leadership journey to this date is really, really important to create those opportunities in a way to program them proactively and kind of to a way that would have seemed artificial maybe 6 or 7 months ago, to actually program them and make sure that they happen. Because especially on the trust building, I think in leadership, a lot depends on kind of mutual trust between a leader and the team. And I would say that's not only in a leader in terms of someone in a management position, but someone sort of overall, like leader with a small L, if you want. Leadership relies on a lot of trust, and that enables collaboration, that enables better communication, that enables a lot of things. And so one of the things that I think really helps with this trust is really programming these additional sort of listening moments, and also being a very humble and active listener. So trying to get information and knowledge that would otherwise maybe be easier to gather from a work environment, but trying to get that in with very intentionally from the team, and sort of piecing together it's like a bit like solving a mystery, trying to get clues onto where the general dynamics of the team are going, and trying to leverage that. In very concrete ways, it's also looking at who's championing things, and how can we support those champions. So for example, there may be people in the team who are more creative, more people who are more innovative, people who are more attuned to learning. And these are all actually attributes that we'd like to support and grow in the team. And so shaping small initiatives around people who want to play leadership roles, small leadership roles with a small L, sorry, not small leadership, but in terms of pushing those different, elements of the organization is a really good starting point. These types of people also tend to be more willing to take risks in whatever it is that they're doing. So let's say they're promoting a learning agenda, or they want to be using more data. They're actually more likely to take risks and try new things than someone who may not be as passionate in that topic. So trying to identify those opportunities by listening very proactively, and then kind of creating a supportive environment. It's almost like a little incubator around these opportunities. One of the things we've brought in is also brought in people who are really good at facilitating these types of processes, like design thinking or managing innovation, and having them sort of coach some of our team members through processes. So that's a little bit what we're doing. Co-creation, I think, is the name of the game, in terms of building together with a team and seeing where it goes, and not being too rigid in terms of, as a leader, in terms of where I want it to go, but really being humble and understanding that the team knows a lot that I don't know, and I should be really listening to, rather than forcing things in a specific direction. So I mean, that's been a little bit my virtual leadership journey so far. I'd really be curious about hearing about more of your leadership journey. What has it been like for you, Dymphna, to lead a team and working during COVID, basically? And can you talk about the complexities of the last few months and how that's challenged your leadership in a time of such uncertainty?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a really challenging period across the board. And I think the thing that I have really learned about sort of that part of the responsibilities as the leader of an organization is the ability to hold the whole space for the organization, but in that process, make sure that you're holding yourself as well. And so sort of that going between what do I need to do to make sure that I can be my best self at work, because if I am not my best self at work, I cannot lead fully, right? And so sort of the learning for me has really been about what do I need to do to hold the organization? And for me to do that, I need to hold myself. And my team sometimes chuckles a little bit when I share this. I'm a very introverted person. I actually, as much as I enjoy this and I get energy out of it, I would much rather be with just 4 people. And I think it's wonderful that there's so many people on this call, but my personality is better suited to the introverted side of leadership than it necessarily is to the extroverted side. And so I constantly have to balance how I regain my energy in a period where I feel I'm holding a lot of uncertainty and just difficult, challenging times. So for me, the learning is in the sort of that balancing act between the introverted self and the extroverted requirements of my position. So maybe Lisa, I know there was a little bit also about sort of how Jean-Louis and I are thinking about leadership, but I see a lot of questions about, again, what you guys actually do. So can we hand it over to you and sort of help moderate some of that?
Yeah, so maybe I'm going to call on Anne, my partner in crime at the center, to help me kind of go through, because I'm going to bounce around here. And I think the way that I'd just like to start is one of the things that we talk a lot about is like tripartite solutions, government working with business, working with nonprofits, working with communities. And I'm wondering, one of the questions here is, does the government collaborate with the Clean Cooking Alliance, and maybe even more broadly, how do you work with other entities to help address the challenges that you face?
Sure, I can speak a little bit to sort of our government engagement and how that sort of like usually shows up, and then Jean-Louis, you should jump in obviously as well. Yeah, we work with governments a lot. Like fundamentally, if you want to change the system, there have to be really solid policies to sort of help spur that innovation and create sort of stability in the market. So we do work with governments quite a lot. The thing that I always say that's really important in that regard is that as we work with businesses, what businesses really need to grow is a predictable policy environment. And I cannot state that enough for entrepreneurs out there. And when students are starting to engage with sort of the entrepreneurs as well, is you can make a business work if you know the tech regime that you're working in, if you know what the import duty regime is going to be, if you know what kind of support you're going to get if you want to expand your production facilities somewhere. And so business people need to operate in a predictable policy environment to be able to grow their businesses. Where we have seen sort of significant setbacks for us as a sector is when a government all of a sudden out of the blue changed a tax regime, for example. Like taxes are so critically important to anybody who wants to build a business that those impacts are really quite significant immediately. And so that's something that we try to stay on top of and be aware of. What we as an organization don't do is lobby. And so there's a difference obviously between sort of how do we help policymakers draft appropriate legislation and sort of suggest certain language to be included and the lobbying aspect of it that we constantly think through. And so definitely lots of engagement there. There is a difference in how we engage with policymakers for different, we call them archetypes of countries. So if you think about a country like China and India, where there's a lot of top-down programming around clean cooking versus countries like or regions like East and West Africa, where there's a lot of entrepreneurial spirit, a lot of investment, sort of impact investment that is going into those regions. There's a different role that we play. And then if you combine that or compare that with countries like Nepal or Haiti that are a little bit smaller, where we have a much better possibility to sort of work closely with the governments there. So we engage differently with governments, because it really depends on sort of the archetype of that country in which we engage. And we want to make sure that we're adding value to what policymakers are needing.
That's terrific. There's another set of questions in here that are a little more kind of about sort of driving demand, right? And I think, yeah, looking at Landon's question, she posed a question very early that had a lot of pieces in it that I think you've covered. But one of her questions was about, how do you help consumers save time and money? And there's another question then that comes in and really kind of raises the question of, if people are collecting fuel for free, it's easy to see how you save time. Yeah. How do you create an environment? What factors have to be in place to get people to be willing to pay for something that in the past that they've been able to do for free? If we don't count the cost of time, right? Time is costly as well, right? And that's an element.
Yeah. This is the hard question, so I'm going to hand that one over to Jean-Louis.
So there's actually an analogy which is a bit unfair, because the purchasing power that we have in the US is a lot higher than a lot of the countries, but I'll still give this analogy. So when you drink tap water, most of the time it's basically for free, especially if you're a renter like me, where your landlord is paying for the water bill. And this has been the case in the US it was the case for decades and decades. And then something happened in the 80s, and people started paying, in the 80s and 90s, started paying for bottled water, as opposed to actually just opening the tap for free, started actually paying for bottled water, of which the quality was the same or, in a large case, inferior to what you would get in the tap. So this has actually been tested. So 1/3 of bottled water you get at the supermarket or wherever, the actual water quality that's measured is actually inferior to what you get from your tap. And people have kept paying for this for decades. And so there are markets where people are willing to pay even for things that don't leave them better off. And so that's an example that shows you that it is possible. We're not saying clean cooking is the equivalent of bottled water, that it serves no function whatsoever, and bottled water may very well have a function for some people. But what we're saying is that you've seen these shifts in markets, these total shifts where you're going from free to paid for no reason that if you were an alien, you would rationally understand why all of a sudden in the 80s we decided that we didn't want to drink tap water anymore. We wanted to start carrying bottled water or buying it at a premium. So to that, there is a cost to wood. It's not really free. The time you're putting into collecting the wood and the risk you're taking are both significant costs, because you could be doing something else with that time. There are opportunity costs. And then in terms of personal risk for safety and your own kind of security, in a lot of the countries we work in, it's significant. It's not trivial. When you're going out collecting woods, you're basically subject to a lot of possible crime. In some countries, even like landmines or such. So the time value of money is a huge one. You could be doing work instead. And on your farm, let's say you have a farm, you could be kind of doing more work. And so a lot of the clean cooking solutions actually bring that sort of value. They're basically saving time. At the frontier, what we're seeing is actually cooking times that are even not only collecting the fuel and getting the fuel, but the actual cooking time, which is a fraction of what it used to be with electric cookers. So more and more, it's still a very small niche market, but what is really at the frontier technology of sort of clean cooking is induction cookers. And here you could have a significant net saving. In terms of the cost, that's a huge one, because upfront, being able to communicate the value of a product, even if you're saving on fuel over time, in many cases, you're actually not just picking up wood, you're actually buying charcoal. The market is such that it's really difficult to compare the overall cost of, having an old traditional cook stove with charcoal to having a natural gas, liquid LPG stove, where you're actually buying the natural gas. It's very hard for consumers to compare the two. And so that's also a big challenge. It could be a lot of savings to actually go into clean cooking.
And can I build on that a little bit?
Yeah.
Because it is like really at the crux of some of the work that we're doing, and why this hasn't, like the last 10 years we've not made enough progress. And so there is also, like, for as we go, and I saw a little bit of that question as well, as we think about the next 10 years, in our theory of change, we are not assuming that every part of the clean cooking sector and the population we're serving is still very segmented within that population. And so the ability for people who currently indeed don't spend any money to collect wood, for them to shift to a system where they're paying for a stove and they're paying for the fuel, is maybe something that will be much later in the next couple of years than thinking about people who live in peri-urban areas, where their ability to purchase, first of all, to find an improved stove and a different fuel set, like find it and pay for it and use it. Like the discussion, unfortunately, I think historically has always just assumed that it's homogeneous, like they're all the same people, and they're not. And so we need to really be careful about that segmentation as well. And so we are very, very aware of the fact that for a huge amount of that population, the fact that they have hardly any disposable income is going to make it super challenging for them to move up a tier, as we talk about tiers in the stoves. And with that, a sort of an acknowledgement of, like, historically, I think some of that language has put a burden on the users, and that is not appropriate either. Like, that is too judgmental. Like, yeah, no, that's like, we need to really be very careful about sort of the families and how people are able to use those stoves. And so really, and I think Jacinta is doing some really excellent work there as well, to make sure that it's like the women users are not the victims. Like, we need to really move away from sort of that narrative that makes them puts the burden on the users only, to make sure that we move a little bit away from that. And so the other thing I wanted to, just on the sort of the product side, and how people want some of the innovations that we're seeing, about how companies are thinking through constantly, like, how do we make sure that our consumers are able to purchase these products, is a different model, for example, around biogas. And so some of you may be aware, but biogas has really great potential, obviously, in many of the areas in which we're working. And so there are companies now out there who work with the farmers. And so they collect the manure, it goes into this really crazy flexible tank, and then gas pretty much gets created. And they use that sort of for cooking at the household level as well. Is like different paying mechanisms for those consumers, thinking through sort of additional income streams, because you can use the compost that comes out of it that can be used and sold for agricultural purposes. So there is a much more creative thinking about how do we get these products to the consumers so that they're actually able to pay for it. Around biogas, we also see, if they do it with dairy farmers, then sometimes the dairy cooperatives will help with the installation and the upfront cost, and then the farmers can use some of the power that's created also to improve their cold storage facilities. And so they increase their yields, their dairy yields, that then the dairy cooperatives use some of that additional yields to pay down the cost of the installed unit. So there's so many different ways that we're seeing out there where people are thinking through how to get customers to pay for it. The other one that I just quickly mentioned is around sort of pay as you cook kind of meters. And so we now see a lot more meters being installed on LPG and other sort of liquid fuels, where, and including, we're exploring one for biogas, right, Jean-Louis? With the metering as well, yeah. And so where consumers can actually just pay in smaller incremental units, so that they don't have to pay a lot of money up front, but can sort of pay differently and sort of pay as you go or pay as you cook. And so that's sort of really exciting because that starts to move the sector forward in a very innovative way that focuses a lot on sort of business model innovation and how do you reduce or how do you improve your margins, which is really what businesses are constantly focused on. So I thought I would share that a little bit as well.
Yeah, and in terms of ability to pay, you also have a lot of interest in carbon finance.
Yes.
So, I mean, there's a whole market for carbon finance out there where you can make money by, selling climate change mitigation, basically offsets, right? And then carbon offsets. And then, so the clean cook stoves are basically displacing a lot of, would-be carbon and kind of CO2 equivalents. And so how do you monetize that? And a number of companies are actually working on that. They're working on sensors that can automate and read out sort of, the carbon sort of offsets that a clean cook stove is producing, and then connect that, through carbon markets directly. And that can help subsidize the price of the cook stove and the fuel for people who wouldn't otherwise be able to afford it. So there's a lot going on there. It's also very complex. So the carbon markets have lots of standards and lots of methodologies for computing offsets and verifying. And so there's a lot of complexity around that. But it's basically where the sector is also going, is kind of putting together concepts that have not been put together before. And that's how you get to disruptive innovation.
Right.
So
which is super exciting.
One of the other questions that's the streams that seems to be emerging here is questions about metrics and how you actually measure your success and set your goals, and the timeline for achieving those goals, and maybe what was one of your biggest achievements, and how did you know that was one of your biggest achievements?
Sure, I can jump in there, and then again, Jean-Louis, you should add a lot and maybe a little bit more around our knowledge management associated with how we're thinking about that. So yeah, I mean, one cannot measure, think about progress if you can't measure it. And so ultimately, as an organization, we are working towards achieving the SDG 7 goal, which is the universal access to clean cooking. There is a lot of challenges just in how you measure universal and access. I just want to be really clear with everybody there. It is the goal we're working towards, but it's a very, very difficult goal to measure and achieve, because universal can never be done as far as I'm concerned. Intellectually, I kind of wrap my, another baby's born, how do you ever achieve universal something? And access is also quite difficult for the sector in our case to measure, because a stove sold does not mean a stove used. And so the whole sort of conversation that is in the sector around usage versus units sold is a challenging one. So right off the bat, it's a difficult goal to really achieve and measure, but we are working and doing our best to work towards it. As an organization, we have just released our M&E framework, which is based on our theory of change, which we also just updated in the last year or so and released. And as an organization, we have, I don't remember, Astrid probably knows, maybe more than 25 different things that we're measuring for and that we're tracking constantly and are starting to get more sophisticated around right now. So that is for us as an organization. And then all of our programs within the organization have their own sort of metrics and any sort of associated frameworks that we are using as well. So for example, Jean-Louis is also responsible for our work in Haiti. The Haiti, I think it's there, they use a results framework, right? Yeah, that one is super complicated as well. And so our job is to really sort of figure out how we can collect the data and how we can verify it as we go through the execution of those programs. So there is a lot of different ones that go across all of the pieces of work that we as an organization do. And then there is the sector-wide M&E that happens that is not necessarily in the control of the Clean Cooking Alliance, but some of our other partners who are working in this same space as well. There is a this is a very crowded space. I'll just say to everybody here, like there are a lot of organizations working in this space. And so to sort of see and figure out how then the whole sector holds itself accountable against reaching that goal is quite complicated. And I'm happy to speak a little bit more to that. But yeah, maybe I'll stop there and see if Jean-Louis, if you want to add something.
Well, and you know, Dymphna, there actually is a question that kind of points to what you were just talking about.
Yeah.
That there are other organizations working in the space. So how do you partner with other organizations, work collaboratively to increase your?
Yeah, I have to say, I think my middle name is partnerships, and if it wouldn't, it would be collaboration. Like I fundamentally know and believe that we as an organization are not gonna ever be able to like fix this, right? That is not within us. That is just not a realistic assumption. And so we work with partners all the time. And I think since I've joined the organization 2.5 years ago, that has really, really been a big part of my job and my constant sort of finding ways to become a better partner to others in the sector is based on that sort of the humble recognition that we can't do it alone. And so if I don't work with partners, then for sure I'm going to fail as a leader, and for sure we're going to fail as an organization. And so what's challenging there is it is actually the work that I really enjoy. Like I really thrive on creating these kind of partnerships with other organizations like the World Bank, like other development institutions just across the world. But it's also super challenging because there's always lots of ego involved, unfortunately. I don't have, well, I mean, I obviously have ego, but I don't think necessarily to do this work. But there always is some of that shows up when you're trying to build partnerships. And all of these organizations are fundraising from the same very small set of donors. And so, you know, as a leader of an organization, you also need to be really realistic. Like, yeah, I can try to create partnerships and like really focus on that and be transparent with our partners. But in the end of the day, they're going to sit in front of NORAD and say, hey, we're God's gift to the world of clean cooking, give me more money. And so there's, and again, I think that's the part that I enjoy as a leader. There's like tension that you constantly have to hold. Yeah, like there's like we work a lot with SE for All, and then I think our partnerships are also increasingly shifting more to what Jean-Louis was saying earlier around sort of this idea of co-creation and making sure that we don't, at the end of when we're thinking about something, say, hey, let's see if SE for All wants to work with us, but like do that from the very beginning so that we're actually sort of creating a shared partnership and ownership around some of these programs that we're developing currently. Jean-Louis, I don't know if you want to add something to that.
Yeah, sorry, I have a helicopter going ahead.
I just had them here.
Yeah, so I think the nature of the challenge requires partnerships and cannot be done without partnerships. So it's basically it's a must-have, not a nice-to-have in terms of the space we work in. Yeah. When I gave you the numbers earlier of 3 billion people and you know the amount of money we need in this sector. So and another example is investors. So investors have actually been investing quite a bit in sort of the, let's say, social space in a lot of the countries that we work in. A lot in the past, let's say, 5 years in off-grid solar, notably, that's been a very hot one. And together, these investors arguably hold hundreds of millions of dollars. We do not have that kind of money. And so how do we nudge them? How do we change their behavior? And how do we address the challenges or the barriers that are preventing them from either being interested or able to invest in the sector? And so those are sort of the questions we ask ourselves, and our entire, much of our market strengthening program is actually focused around that. How do you nudge these players to invest more in the firms that we think are promising in terms of representing the advancement of the sector.
Mm-hmm.
So a must-have, not a nice-to-have.
Exactly. And then maybe the other thing to add to that, sort of the idea of partnerships, is that we are now increasingly really thinking outside of our traditional sector and starting to explore what does a partnership with an entity that is really focused on nutrition and food systems, which ultimately that's what we're doing, right? People are cooking because they want to feed their families. And so how come we haven't really created a partnership with nutrition and there's possibilities there that we're starting to explore, like what would it mean to work together with food systems? How do we work better with health practitioners, like pediatric associations across the world, because they're the ones interacting with those families on a regular basis? And how do we think carefully and thoughtfully and deliberately about getting some of our messaging into how they're reaching out to their communities? And so there's tremendous opportunity there, but also I think from our side, at least, a deep appreciation that it's easy to say, let's do a partnership. It's very, very difficult to actually do it and to see it through and to dedicate resources to it. So by no means am I suggesting this is easy work, but as Jean-Louis said, it's the work that we have to do, right? I don't know if there's Chinese students on the call, but in Chinese you would say 是我应该做的. So this is what you have to do.
So, you know, earlier you spoke about how you really have to tailor your approach to the country that you're in. You're dealing with different cultures, different systems. And so one of the questions that we have from one of our students is, you know, thinking about the way that you work globally, have you faced any sort of unique challenges, or what are the unique challenges that you've faced across different countries? And then there's also some question when we talked, Jean-Louis, you know, raised the issue of water. From the perspective of a system where we have ready access to clean water, and yet we go out and buy bottled water. But there are many places in the world, obviously, where access to clean water is another concern. And so what is the link between issues around the clean cooking and access to clean water?
Yeah, so should I start with the first one around?
Yeah, I sort of combined them in one and then just go with it.
I think some of the challenges we've seen are somewhat to something I was mentioning earlier, which is government and government officials have very, very scarce resources available to make allocations across how they are strengthening their own countries, right? And so the ability to allocate those very scarce resources is already very limited, combined with the fact that there is no ministry for clean cooking. So if nobody owns the issue, nobody's gonna say, hey, let's allocate 10 million to this particular challenge that we're facing in our country. And so the challenges we have in making sure that governments and government officials and heads of departments step up to that plate is because nobody owns it. Nobody owns the issue of clean cooking. And although it's gratifying work because there are so many impacts, the fact that there are so many impacts sometimes makes it difficult to find a place to land it. Is it with the Ministry for Women? Is it with the Ministry for Health? Is it with the Ministry for Infrastructure Planning? Is it with the Ministry for Energy? Like, where does this issue sit so that we can work with the appropriate people within the policy space to embed clean cooking accordingly? So challenges is that like that process of engagement is complicated. It requires people to be on the ground, to really understand how the particular government works and to be able to influence it over long periods of time. And that I, as an organization, we have not been very successful at. And I think continue to sort of really struggle, like how do we best align and sort of strengthen that work there or work with others to do it. So it's sort of like, how do we embed it appropriately within governments?
Yeah, and that seems, you know, you're speaking about partnerships. That's where the partnerships on the ground, right? People who understand the context.
There are other organizations that
in the world.
that do a much better job at that than we do, and so we want to not like set up a whole new shop to do it. Like we want to find partners where we can work with them. I think other challenges is that like sometimes there are certain countries where there is then attention to the issue and programs get designed, but the design of that program almost happens in isolation and is quite static. And because it takes a long time and governments aren't, how do I say this, aren't very nimble by design. Once the program is designed, it's very difficult to adjust those big country level programs to adjust for new circumstances. And so especially in countries where it's like heavy top-down countrywide programs that get designed, it's difficult for us to then influence it. Once they're done, and then, you know, it's like, I don't know of any program where we've been able to really adjust it in a way that it felt appropriate. Oh, and then the water question.
Yeah, for that link between the water issue and the cooking issue.
Yeah, we had an interesting conversation this morning with some, where we hosted a webinar with some new voices, we said, that are sort of a little bit outside of the traditional space that we brought together. And so one of the participants, Helen, who works at USAID, like ultimately, we're all collectively trying to make sure that we create resilient households and healthy families. And so a healthy family has access to clean water, has access to sanitation, has access to nutritious food, has access to electricity, has access to clean cooking. And so all of that is fundamentally combined, like the interlinking, like it's all interconnected 100%. And so, yeah, I think it's a really excellent question and one that we are increasingly looking at, because if there is a program that gets designed that thinks about a particular region in Rwanda, and partner organizations go in and design a program around access to clean water or sanitation, can we then add on a part of a program that says, and access to clean cooking? Because then those communities and the engagement with that community can sort of be packaged much more holistically. And I think there's, that to me at least feels efficient.
So it was interesting to me, and we've been talking a lot about the Sustainable Development Goals with our students, and it was interesting to me that you identified very clearly that goal number 7 on affordable and clean energy was really where you were focused. And we've been talking a lot about how so much is related to systems and they're all sort of interconnected. And so and you kind of just alluded to that, but I'm just wondering, do you think about how, or do you talk about how you intersect with like gender equity and, you know, working with women and obviously clean water and sanitation?
Yeah.
And even Jean-Louis mentioned climate change. So if you could just talk a little bit about that, I think that would be great.
Do you want to take that, Jean-Louis, or?
Sure. So that's a really good one. So when I mentioned in the beginning of the session that we have a lot of different skills and expertise in our team, that's particularly why, because it is systemic, and we need people who understand different parts of the system and who can communicate and who have sort of their networks in different parts of the system. So even internally, we have to very proactively work on this. So there's a mini sort of system that replicates the outside system within the Clean Cooking Alliance.
I never thought of it that way, but that's a great way to think about it.
And it's hard enough to do internally, as you know, in any organization. Having everybody work together and communication flows and knowledge management is hard enough. But doing it externally is also very challenging. I think, so for example, just building on Dymphna's mention of the government. So a lot of the times we may have to find ourselves playing a role of coordination between ministries around the topic, because this is not, there's no other actor who's coordinating discussions or dialogue around clean cooking between, could be the Ministry of Environment, Energy, could be industry in our case, because we have lots of, I mean, we're trying to start up a new industry, so that really matters as well, and Ministry of Economy. So we also find ourselves playing that role. in the case of systems, you also have the big question of governance. So if we've acknowledged that we need innovation at the system level, the whole system, different connections, different things have to change in the system. It's not just about one firm doing something new, launching a new app. That's not going to solve it. Who decides who has influence? Is it the person with the most money? Should it be the person with the most money and power? And how do you get the user involved? So the user is typically the household using the cook stove or whatever fuel is the one that typically has the least, doesn't have a seat at the table, doesn't have time, expertise, income to participate. And how do you ensure that they're also involved in sort of, where the system goes? So we're really looking at that very carefully. We have a process. We have multiple sort of levels of processes to look at that. One is around the work we do on demand, trying to see how we can generate demand. I would say at another level, we're also working on what we call a sector strategy. And this is with what we call the clean cooking sector, which is a sector which goes beyond your traditional industry sector. So it doesn't involve industry players, but we're also looking at donors, governments, foundations, other nonprofits. And of course, we should consider the sector obviously having the consumers and users who are going to benefit from the clean cooking solutions. So the very difficult question here is who's at the seat of the table? There's no representative typically of the user. There's no organization or institution. In governments, you can find a spokesperson on clean cooking, maybe, but in an industry, you have companies, investors, you also have business associations in some cases. But the user, that's a really hard one to crack. I don't know if, Dymphna, you want to say a few more words on how we're seeing kind of the systems approach of the Clean Cooking Alliance going?
Yeah, no, definitely. And sort of to come back, Lisa, to your question around sort of SDGs and why do we reference SDG 7? The reason why we reference it is because that's the number I'm held accountable to. And so clean cooking is in SDG 7. So that ultimately that's what we're accountable to. As an area and sort of from the impact side, we pretty much reach every other single SDG, right? We are relevant for pretty much every single other SDG. And so health, women empowerment, job creation, all of food, all of that is impacted by our work, which is both exciting and difficult because then again, that dilutes a little bit of the attention we would otherwise get if it's uniquely one thing. Sometimes that becomes a little bit easier, but because our impacts are so broad, sort of how do we then engage with UN system, with UN women and girls, like, all of those other UN agencies to make sure that they also are aware of what the impacts of clean cooking are, is sometimes challenging. And I think as an organization, we have not been very good at, if I'm honest. And so would welcome anybody here who wants to become an expert in how do you work within the UN system, feel free and reach out. Because those it's a difficult system to work in. And so I think a little bit sort of linking that to what Jean-Louis was saying, like ultimately a lot of that has to do with storytelling and how do we convince other organizations especially within the UN system to take this seriously and put some attention behind it. Has to do with storytelling. And that's, again, at the impact level, but we're increasingly making sure that the stories, I'm not the person who tells the story. It's really by, women and girls and people who are impacted by it. That is, I obviously think, much more compelling. And so it's, we reach a lot of these goals and we are, I think, getting slowly better at thinking about putting the families at the center of how we think about all of this, but admittedly have a long way to go there.
So Dymphna, one of our students, I'm sorry. Oh, okay. So one of our students was asking about whether there were ways to engage with you and to get involved with the Clean Cooking Alliance. Do you have internship programs, other opportunities to to work with you on things?
Yeah, all of our internship go through the UN Foundation because we are hosted by the UN Foundation. So interestingly enough, my organization doesn't have like a legal status. We don't actually exist.
Don't exist.
We're real, but we don't really exist. So all of that goes through the UN Foundation. So yeah, obviously people should always sort of look out for those and apply if they feel that is of interest. And then more directly, sort of also on sort of the job side, we are always looking for talent, and Jean-Louis is always looking for talent, I know. So yeah, people should definitely feel free to reach out.
Right.
I will say that we are in the middle of redesigning our website, so I don't necessarily suggest the best website right now to look at and educate yourself about the organization. So I hesitate a little to say like, our best way to learn more about the issues going through the website. It is not a very good website. We're working on that.
So one other question that I think is in here that's hasn't been addressed, and it relates back to the discussion we were just having about all of the SDGs, and in particular the SDG around climate change. You know, how big a contributor to to sort of production of carbon is the dirty fuel that's used for cooking?
Yeah, so it really depends on the technology. I saw that question. It's excellent. It depends on the technology and the stove. And so there's different ways to, well, there's not different ways to measure that. I shouldn't say that. Donnie would be very upset with me if you say that. There is only one way to test it, which is a voluntary standard that has been set by ISO that we have worked on for many, many years. And so there's testing labs throughout the world where manufacturers will send their stoves, the stove will get tested, and according to the test results, they get like it's almost like a label, but they are ranked in order from 1 to 5, 1 being not very good and 5 the best sort of from an impact perspective, the best performing stove. So, you know, it really depends on the stove, and it really depends on the fuel, as you can imagine, based on just combustion in general. Yeah, we are happy to share some more detail, and if people want to check that out, I do think that is quite well represented on our website, so people should definitely look at that. I will just quickly, just for people's awareness, one of the biggest impacts is actually around black carbon, and although it's a short-lived climate pollutant, the impact of black carbon specifically in the region of the Himalayan region is significant as you think about sort of how using dirty fuels and sort of the lack of access to clean cooking, the impact that has from China, India, Nepal, some degree in Bangladesh, Pakistan, like just that whole region is tremendous. And really worrying, because then that goes like the impacts there are like so many different ways. And so we do have a program in Nepal, and we work with Ishimod, which is an organization that really focuses on the Himalayan region and making sure that sort of becomes more sustainable. But for those of you who visited Nepal recently, sort of the outdoor air pollution is significantly impacted by indoor air pollution as well. And so there, the direct links to climate change and climate change mitigation are really severe.
And I know you mentioned before that, you know, we had sort of started to talk a little bit about the wood gathering, and you pointed out that we're not just talking about, you know, replacing that it's, you know, burning charcoal and things like that. But to what extent, if at all, you know, we're seeing in the US right now, right, these massive forest fires, and, you know, a lot of discussion that it's about management, right? It's the underbrush grows. And so to what extent is the use of, you know, literally going out and gathering firewood from the forest contribute to like sort of good forest management? And not at all, it's just such a small amount that it's, okay.
No, it's not a small amount, it's actually a big amount. It's a negative contribution.
Oh, so trees are coming down for it. Yeah,
absolutely. Okay. And so on one of my trips I did to Rwanda, a while back, sort of the impacts of, and specifically as it relates to charcoal, so not the collection of just twigs and sticks, but charcoal production. The impact of production on nature, on just natural landscapes it's horrific. It's like a mine. it's a mining operation. And so it's really disturbing to see that. And yeah, so
yeah. I was just wondering if, because
yeah, no, absolutely.
As the underground, that you have to
Yeah.
maintain the underbrush, right? And so if people are actually going out, clearing out that underbrush, and then we had fewer forest fires, does that actually, and just trying to think again from the systems approach, right? A lot of times, like we try to fix one problem and we create another.
Yeah, actually what we see, and I think this is also an important thing to consider, especially when we're working or we're thinking about displaced communities. And so we haven't really talked about sort of what the impact of this is in humanitarian settings, but one can imagine that like from a displaced community and sort of those humanitarian settings, they're already in regions that are really have lots of like scarce resources to begin with. There we have data where the women who have to leave the camps, the refugee camps, have to like walk further and further and further and further, like hours away from the camp back to wood, because scarcity just like extends out from the camps. And so for UN systems to make sure that people who are already going through such horrific displacement and horrible circumstances, and just to then have them exposed to having to go out and find that sort of additional firewood is really horrible. And then having to like the tents and the small gatherings, it's really challenging.
Right, and combined with the safety issues that are
absolutely
in those situations.
Absolutely.
So as we are coming down to just a few minutes left, so maybe I'll just ask one question. Someone has a burning issue that they want to ask. Since we have a lot of our students on the phone and a lot of our faculty who are also, and I guess not on the phone, on the Zoom call, if you wouldn't mind just sharing, like, what are some of the skills and experiences and knowledge activities that you really think that our students need to be competitive in the world in which you're employing people and operating?
Yeah, Jean-Louis should jump in there as well. I always sort of really look for people who have a mindset of like really take to heart this being in service of aspect of our work. And so I always look for people who show up with humility, who show up with a deep appreciation of that sort of the inquiry into these issues that allows for new thoughts to emerge. And so I think really embracing this idea of like, some people call it like baiting with the problem, like sitting with it. And even in interviews, don't always think you have to immediately come up with an answer and say, like, there's reflection that I look for that I think is really important. And I alluded to that a little bit at the beginning before everybody was joining. Like when I used to teach at SAIS, I really encourage students to really be comfortable with ambiguity. And so I always look for people who don't think that leaders come with all the answers. Like that is not reality. Like I don't have that knowledge in my head. So I always look for people who really bring a sense of humility and inquiry and honesty to what is ahead of organizations. Which may be
I would
intuitive.
totally agree. Problem-solving skills, practical problem-solving skills, an open mindset, not being comfortable with the status quo, wanting to sort of improve continuously. I mean, there's a lot of obviously methods that go around that, but strategic thinking, a lot of those things are really useful. And then obviously in an organization where we need to be nimble and flexible and adapting because we're basically always looking for the solution, you also want skills that go with that. So being a good team player, communication, writing, we always write, no matter everybody in this organization does some writing. So being able to structure your thoughts in a very clear and precise way, even if it's very short, we're always writing and we're interacting amongst ourselves and with people outside. And it has to be accurate, precise, and well thought of. And I would say that's a key skill to develop.
And I will
And
tell
it's
you,
not about
Jean-Louis, every faculty member on the call thanks you for saying that, and we'll be
Okay,
sending
great.
I mean,
you your payment soon.
I cannot agree more with you. Like, my job is not to copy edit things that come onto my desk. That is not my job. And so, like, I cannot really, like, that should be your core thing. I'm so glad you brought it up, Jean-Louis. For
Yeah,
sure.
and with good writing skills also, I think, embed good logic and rational
Yes.
thinking.
Yes.
And that's also why.
Yeah. And we promise your professors did not plant that question or the answer.
No, this is phenomenal. We are actually at time. That hour and a half went by very quickly. I can't thank you enough for taking time to share your experience with us and our Mason community. We have board members on, we have students on, we have faculty members on, our dean is on. And so we are just really grateful to everybody who showed up, and to our speakers and to the other representatives from the Clean Cooking Alliance for sharing their time with us today. It was a lot.
Yeah, it was our honor.
Yep, it was a pleasure. Totally. Thank you so much for inviting us.
Perfect. All right. Well, with that, I wish everybody a lovely evening. The weather is gorgeous.
Same here.
Evening. And thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.